Can everybody hear me? I think it's time we pull up to our seats and begin, if that's okay. Glad everybody's enjoying the gathering before the meeting. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We have commissioners from KUB, Jerry Askew and Kathy Hamilton are both here. Thank you, guys. Appreciate that, your attendance. We want to talk a little bit about our meeting schedule, especially as we get into the holidays here. The group expressed the willingness to meet monthly, and we've been doing that, as you know, the first Thursday of the month, and that would be January 6th for our next meeting. Is that okay with everybody? Is there any, that date doesn't strike anybody as onerous for some reason? I don't think there's any football game or anything of great significance scheduled that night. So let's.
Yeah, I may be out of town, but go ahead, that's fine.
Well, I don't know. Dave, we may not want to. Yeah, we'll go ahead and tentatively keep it at that date. I want to mention that one member of the panel has been in trouble coming in the evenings and asked if the group had any interest that would suit him, if the group had any interest in moving the meetings toward the day work day hours, late afternoon, I guess mid to late afternoon would suffice. I certainly wasn't going to volunteer that for the group, but I thought rather than just reject it out of hand, I would throw that out there. Is that anything that anybody finds worth considering, or would that just be impossible for a number of people to build in your schedules? Anybody have a reaction to that? I guess we'd probably have to make sure this facility, or everybody could come and do a little bit of exploration online about that, sharing some emails and with some tentative dates. But if people are open to that, I think what we can do is further explore that as an option and see if we can come up with a time that works for folks. What generally, would 4 be, what is something that's workable, or if we were going to pick a time that, I'm assuming 4 would be okay for him. Talk about a C.
Well, this is always a difficult thing.
Yeah.
I'm always scheduling meetings. I use Doodle Poll. Mm-hmm. Because Doodle Poll seems a great, and if we've decided on Thursday, then you could just take Thursday and break it down into hours and see who can do when. And
right. Well, of course, we'd want to make sure the facility was available.
Yes.
And, staff were available. And then you're right, given that and assuming it sounds like it may well be, yeah, the Doodle Poll is a great device, or, just to see what times. Yeah, that's for sure. You can be infuriated with 3 people sometimes, let alone. Okay, well then why don't we tentatively, let's keep January 6th, and then let's explore the possibility of moving the meeting up earlier, so that would enable, and then we're talking about Hasib is the one who asked, and we'll see if that would help him come. And might even ease the burden on some other folks too. Well, I appreciate your flexibility on that. I guess we should make note of the minutes from last time. Does anybody have any alterations or things from the minutes they think are not correct, or or were left out, or otherwise would like to change? Okay, thank you. Well, we now are ready again to continue our discussion of KUB's rates, and Mike Boland, you've been very patient and very thorough, and I know we all appreciate that as we head into some more slides. I did hear from a few people that we try to maybe move a little more expeditiously than we have, because we know we're not going to get through it tonight. But but on the other hand, we need to talk about something. Let's talk about it. So yes, sir. Ken.
Yeah, just one thing. I've sent to everybody, I hope I got everybody, a copy of a couple of studies about rates that advocate certain principles for dealing with rates. And Gabe and Mike and Mark, I think I sent them to you as well. Now, I just did that like less than an hour ago, so it's not
Okay.
enough time to deal with it tonight. But it's just grist for our discussion, and hopefully, maybe at our next session, we could go through it. One is from the Southern Environmental Law Center, and I work with those people fairly regularly, so if we wanted, we could even maybe call somebody in from there, whatever we'd like.
Okay, thank you, appreciate that, Ken. Okay, and if there's no other comments before we get going, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mike. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Well, they got me wired up today, so I was gonna stand up here. It's on. Can y'all hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. So first of all, let me just say that Dr. Lyons is right. I think there's going to be this session and one more, and I'll be done. So bear with me on that. And I'm just going to pick up sort of where we were last time. Next session will probably be a lot more interesting than this session, but it all builds up to the end, if you will. So bear with me. I'm going to sort of pick up where we ended off last time. Remember last time we were trying to go through some examples of a little bit of rate design thinking. And the whole point of this exercise is really just to illustrate a couple of principles that we'll get to as part of these examples. And so let me start, if I can, start with that. Okay, if you remember, we had a fictitious utility system here. This one was a very simple one. In fact, this one is just the base thing. Let's say we had one water plant right here. We got one water plant. It's got one customer. It's got a pipe and a line going to the house. This customer has costs associated with this customer of $7 a month. That's for the meter, for reading the meter, for preparing a bill, for having a call center to answer calls. There's costs associated with customers, just being a customer. Then there's a cost associated with this pipe right here. This pipe is a capital expense. It's an expense to lay the pipe and get it to the house. That is that. And then there's a cost associated with producing water as well. And so we just numbers here. We said in this particular example, the monthly cost would be $19.50, which is the sum of the capital cost for the main, 5 times 50 cents, $2.50 for the actual commodity, the water, and then $7 for the customer cost, for a total of $19.50, just to set the stage. You could do the same thing we did last time again. You got two of these now, and they're two separate. They're two separate utilities, two separate customers, and both of them again are exactly the same, and each one of them is $19.50 as a total cost, just as a reminder. And then we said, okay, well, let's do like the utility does, which is we're going to aggregate these customers, and we're now just going to have one pipe that serves two customers instead of everybody having their own pipe, their own wires. That's like a true utility there. And the point I was making here is that the point of the utility is instead of having $20 worth of capital costs when there were two separate pipes, now they're able to be served by one pipe that makes it a little cheaper to have the service. So in the old ones that was $19.50 a piece, now you're serving, which would be what, $38, $39. Now you can serve them, both of them, the exact same thing for $35, right? And because you've saved $4 in your capital costs by serving two customers instead of one, with just a little bigger pipe than you otherwise would have had. And I asked the question, well, okay, if this is now the setup, how much should customer one pay and how much should customer two pay under this scenario? Kent quickly said, well, they ought to pay half each because they take in the same, it's the same, everything's the same, you know. If you want to call them the same, they're twins, you know, the one man's here, there's a twin over here. I mean, make them all the same to make it simple. And you're right. That's probably what the right answer probably ought to be, I think. I don't have, you know, what the right answer is, but I think that's probably good enough. Then where we got stopped at, or where we finished at, was the next slide, which is, okay, we kind of knew what the answer was, or I think we felt comfortable with what the answer was last time. And then my question was, okay, now this customer is now using 10 CCF this month as opposed to 5 CCF over there. And the last slide, the last example, both of them use the same. And we said you split it down the middle. And I posed the question then, okay, now we've got one that's using twice as much as the other. What should the bills look like here? And I didn't get a whole lot of response, so let me give you an example of how I think it might ought to be, okay? So if we look at the previous one, both of them using the same thing, the total cost is $35. If we go to the new one, the total cost is $37.50. The difference between the two is $2.50. Why is there $2.50 difference? Well, the reason why is because this one's using 10 CCF instead of 5, so it's 5 more CCF times 50 cents. So there's $2.50 more cost in this example than the other example. So in my simple mind, probably the right answer would be to add that $2.50 to this customer from what this bill would have said. This bill right here would have been $17.50 each. In this example, you'd add another $2.50 to this customer because he used $2.50 more water. And then this customer would still pay the, I forget what it was now, $17.50. This one pay $17.50 and this pay $19. $20, okay. Does that make sense? That the difference in costs here are just the increase in the usage. And that usage increase is 5 CCF times 50 cents, $2.50. This customer pays it, that $2.50. This customer doesn't have to pay that, right? So $20 and $17.50. Does anybody have thoughts or questions about that, Kent? Yeah.
Yeah, very good. I saw it here. Does the customer that's using twice as much put more strain on any of the other parts of the system? In the case of electricity, of course, we have like demand charges, so there's a certain point at which that's true. Maybe with water, it's not true. So we're not asking the big user to pay more for the costs of the whole system than the small user. They're both paying equally for the system, they're only paying different amounts for the commodity.
They're both the same customer with the same size meter, the same
Right.
size everything. One of them just used more during a month
Yeah.
than the other one.
Yeah,
It's that simple. There's not more demand on the system. There's not more reason to think that this pipe needs to be different for one customer than the other,
right,
to answer your question.
right.
But absent that, which is a good question, we'll get to an example of that in a minute.
Right, okay.
As we make things more complicated. But does anybody else have a comment or question about that? That at the end of the day, in this particular example, the right answer, or a answer anyway, very well could be $20 for the one that uses 10 CCF and $17.50 for the one that uses 5 CCF. Now, an interesting thing is once we wrap our head around that factor, then we need to sit here and think a little bit about, well, guess what? This is interesting because we got one customer who's using twice as much as the other, and the difference in their bill is just a little bit. All right? Just think about that a little bit as we go through this, because that's really what the cost would say. Just because you use more of something, if that something doesn't, cost a whole lot, 50 cents, your whole bill is not going to be changing by that much, so that's an interesting example. Let's use a little more complicated example. In this particular case, we got the same two customers. They got the same twins living in the houses. Everything's the same, right? Except one of them's sort of gone now. And they're not using anything that month, 0. And this one is still using 10. All right, now if you went in here and you added all this stuff up, it's $35. That's how much cost is associated with this. So the question is on this one is, all right, what should customer 1 pay and what should customer 2 pay? Or what should this one pay and what should that one pay?
Nothing was used in the house,
Yes, ma'am.
and I've seen the KUB people come out to the house, well, that can't be right, it's, you know, they gave them more of a hassle because they didn't use as much as they thought they should be using. So I'd be interested in what everybody thinks about that, because if they didn't use anything consciously, if they're gone or whatever it is, then there needs to be a benefit for that.
There's a difference in the cost that KUB incurs if you're not using anything. In fact, in this case, last month they used, let's say, the last example, not the month, it was 5. So KUB sold 5 less CCFs, or $2.50 less expense for KUB for producing water because they didn't use anything. Otherwise, all the expenses are the same, right? And I'm sorry you felt like sometimes people give them a hassle if they have 0 usage. Honestly, we're concerned when people have 0 usage, there's something wrong with our equipment. And I can give you bad examples where bad things happen with our meterings and it goes for 4 or 5 months and all of a sudden we figure it out and they get a big bill, and it's worse if we don't follow up on 0 bills. But I'm digressing a little bit here. In this example, this customer is still using 0 CCF, and yet they have the availability of the utilities. If they want to come in here and turn on the water and use it, they can. So it seems to me they're still getting a bill, so they still got the customer cost. We're still got a meter, still reading the meter, still have a call center, they're still a customer, everything associated with that's the same. Just because they're not using anything doesn't mean all of a sudden we're not incurring costs for having that pipe there, right? And if a person wanted to argue, well, if you don't use anything, you ought not pay for this, then that means this person would have to pay for it all, which doesn't make any sense to me.
Didn't use anything because this person did.
The benefit to this person for not using anything,
And this person has used quite a bit.
and this person used 10. If he didn't use anything, he saved by not having to pay for any water because he didn't use any water. But he still, the utility still incurred the customer costs, meter reading, customer service, having a meter, all that sort of stuff. The utility still had to make payments for that main that they built, whether they use them or not. You know, we have customers on our system, at least rumored customers on our system, that have bought these big, nice houses to come in and go to football games. And otherwise, they're sitting there. They may do some other stuff with them, rent them out or whatnot. But we as a utility have to build stuff to serve them, whether they're using it or not. And it's not fair, where I sit, for everybody else to have to pay for stuff they're not using. I mean, if we made those investments, they ought to be paying for it whether they're using utilities or not, right? So, again, in my simple mind, the difference here, this customer is using 0, so the only difference is they were using 5, is 5 times 50 cents, $2.50. So this customer paid $2.50 less than they did last time, which last time they paid $17.50. Now their bill would be $15, and this bill would be $19, which it was last time. Yes.
Yeah, I think, but there's something to what Vivian is asking, I think, because I experienced a little bit of this, not with water, but electricity, because I came to Knoxville to visit my family, but I lived in Los Angeles, and so I didn't use any electricity. And I noticed that there was an $18 charge on my bill. That charge disappeared once I moved back and started using the electricity again. And so there was a charge, like you say, to maintain the capital cost of serving me. The utility didn't know that I was going on vacation, so I keep the whole apparatus together to make sure that I could use the service. But if you go back to the case of water, and I was thinking about what they did at because Los Angeles, if I use more water, that does accelerate expense on the system, because if they have to go to Metropolitan Water District, suddenly they get way more expensive water. So they had figured out a way to incentivize conservation in the water rate structure, so that, and there were people who did not, they felt that their personal freedom was being impaired by being asked to conserve water, so they would go out and just put the sprinkler on and spray water all over the sidewalk just to protest. And so there was a kind of water war about that was conflict between people of different economic groups. And they had to go in the utility and try and figure out a rate structure that would quiet that down, so that people who did conserve would benefit, as I think Dr. Scheib is suggesting.
This is like
And-
you got a non-usage bill.
Yes. Well, I won't use that terminology. What I would say, Dr. Scheib, is there are still expenses that the utility
Right.
is incurring on that customer's behalf, whether they use anything or not. And I mean, that's,
So can that not be, if that was an issue on the bill, would that not be something you'd have to show on the bill, non-usage?
Well-
How would you state that on the bill for a customer? When you're giving them, we're trying to simplify this bill. So how would that show up on the bill?
a residential bill on a water customer has two parts to it, as we discussed earlier. It has a basic service charge, which is like your fixed fee, if you will, and then there's a usage charge. And the sum of those two is your bill.
So the third one would be a non-usage charge.
There's not a non-usage charge. What there is, the usage charge would be zero, but your basic service charge would still be there.
Can I ask Ken a question on this point? Because I'm intrigued by this way of thinking of the non-usage charge that popped up on your LA bill. What had happened if you had your Nest thermostat connected to your phone and you turned it on for an hour?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
So if you, let's assume you can talk to your house through your phone,
Yeah,
and you turn on your heat or your air for 1 hour, because
right.
you know, wait a second, I'm not gonna be here, and I can game the system if I use, let's call it 1 CCF, 50 cents on this docket,
Right.
and that's going to avoid this arbitrary, non-usage fee. What would, do you know what would have happened from the LA perspective? Like, I'm
No,
actually
well, yes,
curious,
I
like,
do.
what would that have triggered? Because now it's not a non-usage fee, now you did use it, like, what would have happened on your bill, do you
no,
know?
it's not a non-usage fee, it's a sliding fee, so that if I came back and I used 1 week's of electricity on that billing cycle, then I'd get a lower fee. As soon as I use the entire component of my normal usage, there's no fee at all. So the fee it wasn't a fixed fee, it was an unfixed fee.
But it
And
was,
so
it was
that-
scaled relative to
That's right,
average
that's right.
usage.
So it was certainly quite a bit less than when I used the electricity. But yeah, I could understand it. There was a cost. I even watched the guy come. It was for my electric car charger, and I watched the guy come and run a new wire down and then put in a new meter. So I said, yeah, they spent some money on me so that I could have that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was fair enough to pay something for it. But they were working on rate structures there, which is kind of the conversation I'm looking forward to us having at some point here, not now, but creating a rate structure that facilitated conservation.
Well,
If someone's conserving and they don't use anything, then they would still have to pay something because of the cost of the pipe and the meter and the billing and all that. Fair enough.
Yeah.
But they should be able to get a benefit from conserving or from their investment in energy efficiency. That's what they were working on there, and that's what I think we could work on here as well. Yeah, I think we need to acknowledge that the utility still has a cost, even if we use nothing. That's true.
Well,
That's absolutely right.
I
But
will
how do
tell
we
you,
then
in our
ins-
water rate design,
Yeah,
if you go back to the first meeting we had, our water rate design has a conservation feature built into it. The first 2 CCF of your consumption is at $1 something,
that's right, yeah, I remember that.
lower.
Yeah.
And anything above 2 CCF is at a much higher rate. So people have the conservation incentive in our water and wastewater rates today. Okay, so that is built in there.
Great.
But this example is more of a theoretical deal
Yes,
about.
I understand.
Okay, this is an example of a more theoretical deal trying to illustrate that even if a customer doesn't use anything, the utility is still incurring costs that it has to recover, that it needs to bill for. And that's one of the purposes of the basic service charge. It's irregardless of your consumption, there are these costs we're going to recover. If you use, then all of a sudden there are usage charges that are associated with your usage. The other charges that are associated with you being a customer and us being ready and willing and able to sit there with service, ready for you to use it. There's a cost associated with that. That's what the basic service charge is about.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
This doesn't factor in a scenario where the owner could stop service, right? So like if you knew you were going to be gone for a long time, or if the house was set to be demolished or something like that, then you would stop service, but you wouldn't have to pay for the line that's still in the ground.
If you stop service, that's right. You're no longer a customer. You don't have to pay for it. When you start service again, if you're starting and stopping service, then help me out. I think there's a fee for starting the service. For starting the service. To keep people from 4 months, you know, I'm going to be gone, let's cut it off, cut it back on. But you're right. If they weren't a customer, then that's a different story than if they're our customer and we're sitting there with our water ready to go, our electric ready to go, our gas ready to go. They don't use it, fine. You still got to pay for having it available, having the service available. So I think this example is pretty interesting, that just because you don't use something doesn't mean there's not cost incurred and that a customer shouldn't pay it. And likewise, the previous example, just to repeat myself, previous example shows you can have quite a bit of difference in your usage, but your bill may not necessarily move a whole lot, okay, if you just look at the underlying utility costs. And so it's a little counterintuitive, because we'll have people call in and say, oh gosh, you know, I didn't use near what I did last month, and my bill didn't hardly go down at all. Well, it may not have. It depends on the utility and the particular rates. That's just a function of our costs that are reflected in our rates.
So let me understand, the basic cost includes a non-usage cost.
I wouldn't use the term non-usage.
What do you call it?
The basic costs include this customer costs, if you will, for having a meter and reading a meter and all that stuff, plus the cost of our investment to have utilities ready and available. That's what the basic service charge is. It's not a non-usage charge, because you're charged that every month, whether you're using it or not. That's the reason it's called a basic service charge. You know, you could call it an availability charge if you wanted to. I don't know. I don't know. Access fee, yeah, that'd be another way of looking at it. There's just a cost of us being prepared and ready to serve.
So those are the kind of things that the public needs to understand.
And that's the kind of, and ultimately, next session in particular, we're going to talk a whole lot more about that, because that's been the subject of a lot of people not understanding. So I want to talk about that a whole lot more as we go forward. And that's also the reason why I want to use these examples to start us thinking about that. Okay, these are just made up sort of examples, but they're intended to to get at some of these concepts.
Hey, Mike.
Well, yes, ma'am.
One question. So say there was a duplex or a triplex there, would they have the same fixed fee
Our
or capital
customer-
costs?
Yes, our customers all have the same, if you're a residential customer, all have the same basic service charges, if you're residential customers. Yes, ma'am. And give me a little bit, and we'll talk about that as well. So let me go to a whole lot more complicated example. It really gets at what Kent brought up earlier, which will be the end of my talk about this stuff. And y'all have to bear with me on this example, okay, because there's a lot of numbers. But it does introduce a concept that Kent kind of brought up. In this particular example, we have our good favorite twins here. You know, both of them are households, both of them using 5 CCF. You know, they both are residential customers. They each got a customer cost about $7. What we entered in, what I've got different on the chart this time is these customers take their usage at about a gallon a minute. That's all their meters will flow, a gallon a minute. We've added one commercial customer or industrial customer up here. He's got a higher customer cost, and that's typically the case, or I would say always the case, for commercial industrial customers. You got a higher customer cost primarily because the meter, the investment in the meter that KUB has for that customer is higher. So anyway, the customer cost is a little bit higher. The interesting thing about this customer is they use 500 CCF, which is a lot of volume, but the biggest issue here is they used it at 20 gallons a minute, whereas these houses down here only could use 1 gallon a minute. So if you think of a pipe, how do you size your pipe? You don't size the pipe based upon the volume over 50 days. You size your pipe based upon the instantaneous flow that needs to go through that pipe. So a customer that can take water at 20 gallons a minute is 20 times the impact on the system as somebody that takes 1 gallon a minute. Kent was getting to that a little bit a while ago. And what does that mean? Well, that means that in the case of this industrial customer right here, we had to make a whole lot more investment in this pipe because now it's got to be a whole lot bigger. If it was just those two customers before, they only took water at 1 gallon a minute, so you could get by with a little bitty pipe because you're not having to deliver it very fast. If you get an industrial customer, all of a sudden you got to have a great big pipe because when they turn it on, they want it to flow, you know, with a big F, flow. It's introducing a whole nother concept associated with how you allocate costs. And again, the word that is used in utility business, which Kent uses, is the demand. It's what's the demand on the system associated with these customers. So in this, again, these are just made up numbers. In this particular case, I said, well, the capital cost is now $32 to serve all these customers. And the question becomes, okay, what's the fair share of everybody paying under this scenario? Well, the customer costs are pretty easy. You just assign the customer cost to the particular customer. You know, each household pays $7 worth of customer cost, and the industrial pays $10 worth of customer cost. And the usage costs are pretty straightforward. The residential customers are both 5 CCF, so 5 CCF times 50 cents is $2.50. So in the case of the industrial, it's 500 CCF times 50, which would be $250. So all that's pretty straightforward. The issue is how do you divide up the capital costs? And this is a theme in utilities, which is what all the rate design stuff is all about, and the cost of service is how do you divide up the fixed costs amongst customers? Terry's probably heard a lot about this in all of our TVA conversations. It's really who pays what share of this $32. When we just had everybody the same type of customer, before we just had residential customers. One used more, one used less, but they always demanded the same amount of investment in pipe. Now, all of a sudden, you got this customer that's demanding a whole lot more investment in the pipe. So we've got to allocate it out differently. I will tell you one way of doing this is to take the 20 gallon a minute plus the 1 gallon here, 1 gallon here, and say this pipe has got to be able to handle 22 gallons a minute. Y'all see that? Okay, so that pipe's got to be able to handle 22 gallons a minute. The capital cost in this pipe, handling 22 gallons a minute, is $32. If you divide 32 by 22, it's $1.45. So it's $1.45 per unit of capacity to serve these customers. So since this one's just 1 gallon a minute capacity, they ought to pay $1.45 for the capacity on that pipe. This one ought to pay $1.45 for the capacity on that pipe, and this one ought to pay $29 of the capacity on that pipe, because that's their share of costs they caused us to incur. Now, that's a lot of talking, and that's a lot of numbers. I'm not intending to lose anybody. I want to make sure everybody sort of understands the logic here.
I have a question.
Yes,
Because
ma'am.
I thought about this when we were doing the tours, because I think we talked about it when we come back on that bus. Are we catering to that industrial customer more so than to the residential customer? Is it fair for them to pay any share of what that industrial industry is putting on that pipe?
The way I just did the numbers, the industrial customer is paying their share of the pipe. They're paying 20 out of 22, under my scenario, of their share. The total pipe, well, you know, I put this up here for a reason. I ought to use it. You got one customer that does 1 gallon per minute. And you got another customer that does 1 gallon per minute. And then you got one customer that does 20 gallons per minute. So that pipe in the middle is designed to flow the sum of these gallons per minute, 22 gallons per minute. That's how that pipe is designed. So we got a pipe like this. The industrial customer takes up 20 of the 22 gallons. So they ought to pay for everything but this. This is all industrial paying right in here, because they use 20 of the 22 gallons design cost is paid by the industrial. The way to get at that then is to take, I don't know if I can flip the page or not, is to take the capital cost associated with the pipe, which is $32, pipe cost, and divide that by 22. And I had the benefit of doing this ahead of time. It's $1.45 per gallon, and if you're in engineering, per minute is what.
I understand that.
Okay.
My question is, when you put industrial client customer on the line with the residential,
Yes, ma'am.
when you bring them in and you're trying to attract them to the city or whatever, why is it that they would not pay more than those two residential? Why does it have to be equal when they're making these two pay more because of the force and the amount that they need?
No,
So I'm
actually, they
saying-
wind up paying less. Let's go through the math here. In this particular case, this customer pays $7 plus, and this is just artifice almost, 5 times 50 is $250, so it's $950. Plus, in this case, it's $1.45.
But
So
if they went on the line, would it
they
be?
pay like $11 or something, is what the residential customers would pay. And the commercial customer would pay a whole lot more. In the capital, yeah, the customer charge for them is $10. versus 7, just because we got more investment there. And the cost that they pay for the pipe is a whole lot more as well, because they demand more investment in order to serve them.
And I think what's interesting is you flip back to number 5, in the previous example, without that customer, without the commercial customer, you had a $16 pipe that was split between these two customers, and they were each paying $17.50, and now they're paying $11, because the industrial customer has picked up a a larger share of a larger pipe, but the portion attributed to residential is now much smaller because they're on a shared line.
Yeah, the biggest difference in how I monkey with the numbers, the biggest difference is now you've recognized the fact that the capacity of that pipe is designed to serve individual customers. And the person that causes the utility to incur the cost is the one that pays for it. So the industrial customer that will cause pipes to be bigger than they otherwise would be pays for those pipes to be bigger. It's not a detriment at all to the residential customers. It's really you bill what the person or party that causes the cost is how you bill the costs. Cost causation is the word that's used in the industry.
Yeah, and I think like Mike, the other, was thinking about what you said the last meeting, Tim, kind of your alternative proposal, which is really interesting too, which to me would say, well, the incremental cost between what these two residential customers were paying and what they have to pay, what the total capital cost is now with the commercial customer is only 32 minus $16. So why isn't the commercial customer just paying $16 instead of what we've now attributed as 29?
Yeah.
And so that to me is a really interesting question, because you're saying, well, look, you were paying this before. Me adding it just increased cost $16. I'll pay that, but why am I now picking up the tab for this additional infrastructure that used to be paid by this other class? And that to me is an interesting, I think that to me is, this is the example you tried to get at, which is like, well, wait a second, why is that 32 divided by 22 the right way of handling it?
But it probably also depends on if the cost of the increase in infrastructure is proportionate to the size of it. Because it may not be, there may be like an economy of getting a bigger pipe, or it could cost a lot more per volume. You know what I mean? I don't know. I don't know if your numbers are reflective of reality and proportion, or just...
Honestly, as I said before, these numbers were put together just to illustrate principles. And the principles are, number one, that there are costs that are incurred by the utility on customers' behalf, whether or not they use anything, number one. Number two, you can change your usage by a whole lot, and utilities costs may not change much at all. And then the third thing is, when you get deeper into all this stuff, the rate at which you use your utilities drives utility costs, which then drives your bills. So if you use electricity, water, whatever it is, if you use a whole lot of it really quick, it costs us a lot of money to provide that service, and we bill you a whole lot differently. If you're building a commercial development and you only have to have a 2-inch water line built in there to serve the load, that's a whole lot different cost from us than if you need an 8-inch line in order to serve that load. And our bill to you would be different associated with that different size line. It's that simple. It's a cost causation type deal. I'm fixing to jump away from this because that's all I was trying to get out of this. It was just the idea, those three sort of concepts, that right there. The reality is, I'm gonna go to the next slide. I'm gonna make you mad because I'm gonna say, the reality is, this is our water system. We got pipes going every which way. We got water tanks. We got pumps. We got a treatment system. We got lines way out here in Jefferson County. We got lines every which way in the real life. Can we do what I just did for 2 or 3 customers? No, we can't do that. The examples I put together was assigning all of the capital costs to the fixed charge. In every case, I said, okay, this person ought to pay half of 16, or this person ought to pay 19, or this person ought to pay 29, I guess, in the case. We were assigning all that fixed cost directly to a customer based upon our knowledge about that customer. That's really not the way our rates are designed, nor is that the way many rates are, very few rates are designed that way, because you don't have that ability to look at it that granular. So what are done, and what's the theories about what's done? What are the theories underlying our cost of service? Again, it was simple to kind of think about when we had 1 or 2 or 3 customers. When you got something like this, you can't do that. So what we're taught by the American Public Power Association, which represents, again, about 2,000 municipal electric utilities, and they also, the people that teach that also do water and wastewater and everything. But what they talk about is people ought to pay in their basic service charge, that fixed fee, whatever it takes to get 1 drip of water out of the faucet, 1 kWh to the house, 1 very minimum amount of any utility to you. Everything above that minimal level of just, there is some water coming, to what you actually use, that ought to be in the usage charge. The stuff that's required just to have the service at your house ought to be in the basic service charge. The methodology they use, or was used on our rates, is called minimum system design. They go back and they mathematically assign, take our costs, and they divide them. Well, this amount of cost is associated with just having the smallest pipe necessary to serve you, even though in reality we're going to give you something bigger. And they say, okay, what would that cost? In the case of the water system here, the cost of service would say, well, 66% of those fixed costs, those pipe costs, ought to go in the usage charge. 33% of it ought to go in the fixed charge. So unlike our examples, our rates do not have all those fixed charges in the basic service charge. What's in the basic service charge is a very much reduced amount of cost that's reflective of cost above what's necessary to be just available.
So Mike, go back to that 66 and 33. Is that an actual number that you use, or that the APPA recommends?
That's an actual number that they calculate as part of their study, and is reflective of the cost of service that I'm fixing to show you for water. Electric is different. Every utility is a little bit different. The calculation on electric is almost 50-50. 50% of the capital cost in the electric system is built into the basic service charge. 50% of those capital costs are actually in the usage charge, is how it's allocated.
And they're doing that based on like national
Yeah, they're
assessment.
doing it
Yeah.
based upon what they do for, or what they recommend anyway, for all the APPA customers. In fact, the people we had do our study were actually the trainers for the classes. So we feel very good about what they did. And that's the next thing I'm fixing to show, is at the end of the day, when they come in and do their magic, what were the results of their quote-unquote cost of service studies? So before I get into them, let me give you some highlights. First thing is, they looked at all 4 divisions, water, wastewater, gas, and electric, and they found similarities between them all. And the similarities is that the residential customers are paying below what they would say the cost of service is. And they would say that commercial customers are paying above their cost of service. I don't want to use the subsidization word, but I would just say commercial customers are paying more than they think they ought to, and residential customers are paying less. So, and that was consistent across all of our utilities. They looked at our basic service charges because that was a controversial thing. So they looked at our basic service charges, and all of them were appropriate. What we were charging were below the cost of service, with the exception of wastewater. At the time, we were paying $1, maybe more than what they thought was appropriate. The fact that the commercials pay more of the cost of service than the residentials is really kind of similar to a lot of other utilities. Terry's been in meetings with me. TVA talks about having bubbles. Remember the bubble charts, Terry? They have a bubble and say, well, there's a zone of reasonableness here around which is appropriate commercial rates and appropriate residential rates. You know, you're not being exact. He did note, the consultants did note, that our water and wastewater system look a little different than some of them they look at. And the reason why is because of all the dollars we've shoved into those systems. In other words, our systems has more dollars invested in them than the typical system because of all of the work we've been doing, particularly on the wastewater side, because the EPA mandated investments. So that one's a little different than what they were used to seeing. So here is a cost of service results. And just for your information, all these cost of service studies are on our website. If you researched hard enough in there through link, they're on there, and they have been on there. So this is our electric cost of service study. Let me kind of orientate you here a little bit on how all this works. So right here, all the different types of electric customers we have. Residential is the first one. Small commercial is the next one, and those are customers less than 50 kW, which Weigels would be in that category. Pardon? No, I'm okay, thank you. The medium are from 50 kW to 1,000 kW, I think. And you're getting a little larger customers, and you can see there's a little less in those. You get beyond 1,000 kW, it really falls off pretty quick. So there's very few of these type customers here. The consultant goes in and figures out what they believe is the appropriate allocation of our costs, which here's our cost, $557. What's the appropriate allocation of our cost to the various customer classes? And I think I will get my water. Thank you. So they figure out what they believe and recommend is the appropriate amount of cost you should allocate to each of those classes. And that's what's in this column right here. For each of the classes, this is what they believe the dollars ought to be allocated to those customers of our costs.
And Mike, when you say cost of service, I think I heard you say, like, this is that basic cost for one unit, or is that total revenue requirement?
Nope. Let me back up.
Okay.
This bottom number down here, Aaron, is like our total budget for the year.
That's your total revenue
That's
requirement.
our total revenue
That's the
requirements.
37 that you need
And
from
we,
everything.
Yeah, and we've taken,
the
what we've done
$37, yeah.
is we've taken that total revenue requirement
Okay,
and we divide it amongst the rate classes.
got it.
So that includes all the capital costs plus what you had to pay TVA for the electricity as well.
In this case,
usage
yes.
in these numbers.
Yes.
Right.
And I think it's appropriate to note that because we're a nonprofit, there's no profit built into these numbers at all. You know, these numbers are just what our costs are to provide service. So,
Can I just
Yeah.
ask one little, before you go on? To allocate the different amounts of cost of service to those different categories, do you divide it up by the amount of stuff that you, like the kilowatt hours of electricity that go to each category?
there's an allocation for electric, maybe a bad one to start with because there is the power cost stuff that has to be allocated. as well as KUB costs associated with our facilities. So this includes both those things. It includes the allocation of TVA's power costs to customers, as well as our costs of KUB's facilities to customers.
And
It's
so,
a combined amount.
and so the first, oh, go ahead, Ken.
I'm not clear yet.
Okay?
I think I see what you're saying, but if. Well, say, medium commercial, 129, residential, 2, let's say, just to be wacky, that the cost of providing residential electricity is twice the cost of providing medium. Is that because residential uses twice as much electricity, or is there a different way of factoring that?
No. Let's start with what's in this, so maybe that'll help. This number right here includes the KWH we buy from TVA to provide service to residential customers. This number includes the demand charges we incur from TVA on the residential customer's behalf, based upon how much they're using when we peak and have to pay TVA. You get that? So those TVA costs are built into this number, as well as KUB's costs for providing service to those customers are built into that number. Fixed everything, yes, all costs are built in that number, and that's the same with all these up and down the way.
Great, that answers my question.
Okay.
Thanks.
So can
Now,
I
I'm
go
not sure if
one-
everybody else understood, but again, all your TVA costs are built into these based upon their usage, based like all those customers in that class, based upon their demand on our peak that we incur from TVAs built in those customers, and as well as then our physical costs that we incur are built into these numbers right here.
So on the physical cost that you incur, that third piece, any insights about, I mean, that breakdown then starts to be a little, like there's a lot of assumptions into that. How do you divide out the KUB cost amongst these customer classes?
The KUB costs are derived by the minimum system design that the person comes up with, the consultants come up with, as well as, honestly, it's their capacity factors, it's their usage of the system, like we described previously, that's incurred by each of these categories as well. Do you want to?
I was gonna say, there are many costs going into that. They will have different methods for different types of costs. Where the TVA costs, we know exactly.
Yeah, you know exactly what it is.
We can match
Yep.
it perfect. For other costs, like my salary, you have to make an
Yep.
assumption.
Yep.
So they put them into buckets like customer related, and then they apply different factors that make sense
Got it.
depending on the cost. So, does
Yeah.
that help at all?
It does. I think those assumptions, if I were imagining, that's what you're getting at with these kind of, like, that's the 32 divided by 22 assumption. Like, you've made a there's a mathematical assumption
There's-
about
yeah,
how we
there are a
might
whole lot
divide
of those.
out. And that's what's going into that calculation, and your consultant has some industry standards that they're applying.
Yes, and these are specific to KUB also.
Yeah,
So when Mike talked about that study, they are taking KUB's costs. They're not just plugging
Sure.
a percentage out of the air. It is from our expenses and our miles of pipe and our miles of wire and the sizes. Everything is specific to KUB.
yeah, because you're able to imagine, like, if you look back at that map, like, you could run a trunk line, and you can identify this trunk line has this much debt left on it, or whatever.
Oh,
And
you
then
couldn't
you're,
do
I
that. We
mean,
couldn't do that.
do you actually, I mean,
I'm just
how
telling you, we couldn't do
detailed
that.
do you get? Because, I mean, there's almost an element of like, okay, trunk line, or I mean, I don't know how you divide out your electric, but like substation, like there's 3 commercial customers on this substation, but it's 98% residential. Like, is that level of granularity going into it, or is
Nope.
it?
Not
Okay.
that, but it does go pretty deep as far as we are looking at, again, this size of wire versus this size, and what does that cost in today's terms? And then you're getting a numerator and a denominator and applying that,
Got it.
so.
So those costs reflect the larger wires rather than pipes in this case.
Yeah.
That goes to the plant.
Yes.
That's captured in the cost column.
It is, and also the usage of the substations you know, large commercial customers will require larger transformers, and that goes all the way back through our system, all the way to our in-feed TVA. There's costs associated with that demand or that capacity. So electric may not be, it's not as intuitive. Maybe I shouldn't have started with electric to start with, but again, going back to, okay, well, how's all this set up? All right, here's the recommended, what they've calculated to be the cost of service for our electric system, right here in this column. This is for 1 year. It's yes, sir. This is and this number down here is actually sort of our budget for the year that they got to tie back to. They basically taken our budget and divided it out amongst the classes is what they've done. But that budget includes the TVA costs in the case of electric.
So your challenge on the revenue is you got to get to that bottom line somehow.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. And in this column here, this is taking our current rates at the time they did the study and multiplied it by the billing, the KWH per class and the basic service charges that we're going to get per class, all the various sources of revenue we have. This is the projected revenues on our existing rates. And so the difference between the two, this is what the study says we ought to charge residential or collect from residentials, $285 million. Instead, our current rates are only going to collect $261 million. So if you were going to collect what cost service study says, you would raise residential rates by 9.1%. In other words, we're under collecting from our residential class based on what the cost of service study would say by 9%. Conversely, if you look at the majority of our commercial customers, I'll just throw in all these right through here. If you look at the bulk of our commercial customers, what we're actually collecting from each one of these is higher than what the consultant would say is the appropriate amount to be collecting from them. So in these cases, in each one of these cases, you'll see in order for us to try to bill what they believe the cost of service is, we would have to lower rates to small commercial by 14.3%, 8.7%, so on and so on. So under collection of cost of service costs from residential, an over collection of cost of service costs from commercial customers. That's what this shows and was the results of the studies.
Hey, Mike, can I go back to your example? Because I really loved the water graphics. They helped me tremendously.
You want me to go back somewhere?
So, no, you don't have to go back. I'm looking at your flip chart with the math.
Oh.
So.
You want this or the previous one?
No, you're good. Well, yeah, I mean, either one is fine. So, I mean, essentially, like, there's an element of we need 22 units, and we divided that out because we said 1 + 1 + 20 equals 22. Right. And that's 145 proportional per gallons unit. Per minute unit. Yeah. And am I interpreting it correctly when you say under collection of commercial versus over collection of residential, that what the current rate and revenue structure creates is that you're actually putting 21.5 on commercial and only 0.5 units on residential? Like, is that the correct way of thinking about it, or are they just totally unrelated? Like,
well, I would say a better way to think about it is, in that particular example, we were going to collect $29 of capital costs from the commercial customer, and we were going to collect $1.45 from each of the residential customers. This may indicate that we're actually collecting $32 instead of $29 from the commercial. Yeah. And we're only collecting $1.15 from the residentials. Okay. That's what it.
Okay, that's helpful. I think we're saying this. It's not necessarily proportional, but it's saying that you're collecting.
Does that help you think about it a little bit better?
More.
And it speaks directly to Dr. Scheidt's question about, are we subsidizing the business customers on the backs of residential? And we're doing the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, and again, if we go back to the previous slide, whoop, I'm going the wrong way. This is what I would point to right here. You know what?
That's typical.
We're doing that, I mean, that's the results of this cost and service study, but that's not necessarily unique to us.
Yeah.
That the way most people's rates, if you looked at them, that very well may be the same way. That there's an under collection of costs on the residential side and an over collection of costs perhaps on the commercial side. So that's the results of the electric system. And then we did the same study on all of our systems, and I'll run through those real quick. So you'll have those. Here's the gas cost of service. In gas, there are less customer categories, so it makes it a little easier to see here. Again, you got the same under collection, about 10% on the residential side, and you got an over collection on the commercial side, in excess of 10%. That's occurring. Water cost of service, this is probably more extreme than any of the others as far as the results of the study versus what the cost of service study said. It indicates that residential customers, I don't know what I'm doing. Residential customers are underpaying by upwards of 20% of what the cost of service would say, as opposed to the non-residential customers or commercial customers paying more than 20%, or right at 20% more than the cost of service would say they ought to pay. You know, it's interesting this is just an aside, I guess, but when you get a situation like this, or let's use gas, it's a lot less extreme. When you get something where a class of customers is paying underneath and another one's paying over, if a person was to say, well, that's not right, we got to correct that. If you were to try to do that, it'd be very difficult to do it right away. You'd have to incrementalize it and get into it over time, try to make a little bit of progress. So, for example, if KUB was to raise rates 2%, you may raise commercial rates by 1%. And you might raise residential rates by 2.5% to try to eventually pull them back into better alignment. I know TVA's exercised and done that over time. They try to incrementalize getting where they need to be on their rates. Doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. I don't know what I'm talking about, so sorry. But once they get out like this, they just stay out. I guess what I'm trying to say. I think I showed the water. Wastewater, a little better in sync here. Residential, about 10%. Commercial, about 10% the other direction. So in all cases, every case that our consultants looked at a cost of service for us, they showed the same thing, that residential customers were paying less than the cost of service, commercial customers were paying more. Yes, sir.
Is this intentional over a period of time? I mean, to get here, this is present rates, and they've gotten here over a long period of, of adjustments over decades.
That's right.
Has this always been reasonably top of mind that you'd have a distribution that would look like this as a goal, or did it kind of evolve into this, or say, how did we get here?
I would say this. I think, first of all, you're right on target about, hey, this is like a 50-year, 60-year, 80-year, 100-year sort of history getting up to where we're at. I would say that there hasn't been any intentional change over time to get us here. I think it's probably just a continuation over time of what's always been.
Okay.
Those percentage change has been consistent for many years in these categories. So it seems like if they have, it would be much easier to make those tweaks and get them to where everybody's kind of paying attention.
Yeah. You know, if we were going to tweak to get them back to where they were, first of all, we'd have to be changing our rates a lot in order to make a difference. You know, most recently, particularly on the electric system, well, that's wastewater, but I started with electric, didn't I? On the electric system, we've been raising rates like 1% per year If you're doing a 1% per year change, even if you were trying to move the needle a little bit, and you're saying, okay, well, I'm gonna do this one by 0.5% and this one by 1.25%, you can't hardly get there, you know? But I don't know that, let me answer it a better way. I don't know that our goal is to drive our rates to where these are exactly with the cost of service. That is not a goal that we're trying to accomplish.
And the reality is, if you said, okay, we were gonna try to take water, for example, and begin to change that, and you had a 5% water rate increase, and, you know, we say, we're gonna raise rates 5%, well, how much is residential going up? Well, it's going up 8%. And how much is commercial going up? It's going up 2%, because we want to try, that's not going to be very popular. And
If we're flipped and the residential was paying,
Yeah,
subsidizing,
absolutely.
how would you treat it then?
Oh, yeah, I think there'd be an uproar for us to change it right away.
that would be more popular.
Well, this is,
Yeah, oh, yeah, there's no doubt at all.
well, it's a long-term manifestation of the
That is-
words you hear now, which would be equity. I mean, basically, that you're not looking for equality against the class for all kinds of reasons. I mean, you've got a lot of residential people with minimal ability to pay. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why it probably ends up looking like that, and it's been kind of purposeful or intentional, maybe not specifically, or it wouldn't have just ended up like this in most utilities, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't know that the desired outcome would be. I mean, that would be a philosophical question. Should everybody, what is the, you know, you always hear this fair share, you know, and there's probably reasonable consensus across the country for lots of things like this, that this might be considered fair, even though it's not equal. I mean, you know.
the reality is that as we started talking to the group here tonight, Dr. Scheib was worried about residential subsidizing commercial. I mean, that was underlying some of your questions. And heaven forbid if we actually had our rates set up that way. I mean, just as Mark said, if you're going to do it one way or another, you're better off to favor the residential customers than you are the commercial customers, because everybody already thinks you're favoring the industrial customers.
Yeah, but I have a question about, you said that the rates have to be changed gradually to not create like an economic shock to the system. That sounds right. But the fixed fees have doubled over the past decade, so that seems like that kind of is a shock to the system. How did that fit in with this philosophy of gradualism that you're talking about?
Next session we get into starts out with some slides about our rate increase history that gets right at that sort of question. So we had 2 nights. That's the subject of the next night.
But if these percentage changes have been consistent over many years, at what number percentage would you consider them out of range that you would need to get them back in range? So is 15, is it 20?
I would have 2 answers. First of all, this cost of service number here that our consultant has said, I know he's done a great job. I know he's doing the standards that everybody else is doing. I would say there are multiple people that might have different ways of doing that. So I wouldn't put as much, it's got to be exactly $285 million, and it's off by 9.1%.
No, what I'm
It's
saying,
somewhere in
by
there.
a segment.
Yeah.
So if the commercial was subsidizing
Yep.
by 15%,
Yep.
we know that if that flipped and the residential was subsidizing by 15%, you'd probably consider that out of range and
Right.
try to fix it.
Right.
So let's take it to the commercial. If commercial is 25% out of range, at what point would you address it?
I'm not going to answer when we would address it, because that's a board decision, not mine. But what I will say is that as a person that worries about these sort of things, I worry about this one a little bit. I don't worry about this one a little bit. I don't worry about that too much.
There's sort of a zone of
but this one-
reasonableness.
this one
and
here-
once you get to like 20%, it's like you begin to, you know, may feel a little uncomfortable.
Is that a better way to answer
It
your
is.
question?
I mean,
this
you kind
one,
of hit a number there.
yeah, this one's kind of, feel kind of bad. This one, you know, I don't feel bad about that. I'll just tell you, I don't. And I think water is the only one that's really kind of out there. Oops.
Well, part of the policy issue is that then that would be a consideration.
Yeah, and you know, in that regard, it's interesting, if you looked at electric, it shows up better than anybody. But on the electric system, when you get into very large customers down here, you know, the big customers might want to locate in our system, I guarantee you we're competitive. And we're not charging them any more than we have to charge them, to have them on our system, just for the reason that Commissioner Askew talked about. We've got to be competitive for economic development. But for the Walmarts of the world, that's going to locate here anyway. I don't want to be crass, but there's flex in here to cover this. You get the very large customers, not as much. Got to be more competitive.
One thing I do want to point out there, though, when you do that, you know, you say that, you know, we can charge these people more if they're not going anywhere. What that does, though, we raise the cost of groceries, raises the cost, you know, those people do just raise their prices. And so that then reflects back to everybody, so.
Yes, I won't disagree. I think the question here from, I think the question here from Mr. Hill is right, is at what point do you start feeling squirrely about it? And hopefully I answered that question. Plus or minus 10%, and you know, beyond that, it's a little.
Can I ask, before we leave kind of the examples of your houses and your buildings? And this, Amy, you had mentioned this about multifamily. So duplex, that kind of thing kind of fits in the single family model, but where does a larger, you know, let's call it a 400 unit, Sutherland Avenue kind of complex, where do they fall? Because I know I think they're billed as residential, but maybe they're not, and I misunderstand that. But where do they fall in the system?
Yeah, typically they would be individual electric residential customers. For water service, typically it's a primary meter that's paid, say, by the university or the housing management company on that, and they build that into the rent of what they charge on that. It's charged a commercial rate.
Even on electrical?
No.
So the electrical has an individual meter, but the
Individual
water
meter,
has a
individual residential customer, water, sewer is different.
Got it.
And there's every variety in between, but that's generally.
And again, Aaron, my examples of individuals were simply examples. The reality is it's all too complicated to do onesie, twosie sort of calculations. It's all done in a big old bill. So at the end of the day, this is about deciding how much dollars for each class of customer we ought to collect from that class. This is not what our rate design ought to be. This is a cost of service, which is a different matter, which we'll get more into the rate design a little bit next time. Yeah, that's all I had for this time.
Yeah, a couple minutes, if anybody has any final questions or thoughts for Mike. That's really very helpful.
Well, if you come to any at all, try to come next time. That's when we'll be talking about all these basic service charges. It seems to be a question of what's the right number, what's the wrong number. Have a lot more direct conversation about that.
Thank you for that. It was hard for you to do, and I want you to be offended by questions.
Oh.
That's what we need. That's what I need. When I go back and people have reviewed this or they're asking me questions, I need to be able to take what you're telling me and put it so John Q. Public can understand.
Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'm trying to do that without talking too much.
You did great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, so what we're going to do is do a little scheming around with maybe Doodle Poll, whatever device we want to use to try to find out another time for our next meeting on the 6th and see whether we can come up with a one that works for most, hopefully everybody, but most folks. Getting that information out to you. Have another session where we'll get really into the at it, but then, let's say, the entire fixed portion and variable portion by use is obviously something that will come into discussion at that time.
Talk about the history of how we got to where we are, and also do benchmarks, comparisons with other
Okay, good.
peer utilities.
Do you have communication with some of the people who are not here frequently? Because I've missed some of their voices, and I haven't reached out to them myself either, but it'd be nice to.
One is Tennessee, he's had problems, so that's, he's the one who had asked, I'm sure he wouldn't mind my using his name, but asked if we would consider the evening has been a real
okay.
problem.
Yeah,
So he's
right.
one who was very active early in our Zoom meetings, as you may
Right.
recall. But I think this is probably a good time to maybe check in and see,
Yeah,
make
good,
sure
good.
everybody's still with us.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Cheater babies doing. Coming up, fun.
Okay.
It's not your first though. It's like it is your first. Oh, congratulations! Yeah, have fun.
Things. You get up there, you just gotta have things, you know? Hey.
We're gonna send you and Sherry the teacher calls to Kelly.